Wouldn't it be a tragedy if our first encounter with a non-human intelligence led to us acting offensively, violently, and aggressively against them? And that's what I understand is happening. I am told we, the American public, should be informed we are using high pulse microwave weapons against non-human craft. And we are bringing those craft down so that we can retrieve them and salvage the technology. God knows what we're doing to the alien beings inside those craft. I hope we treat them with respect. Heaven help us if there's ever a reckoning for the crimes and the immoralities that we've committed in the name of national security.
There's obviously the donations. A lot of these members in Congress are heavily supported by the defense contractors. We've also kind of got the Defense Department as well, lobbying against this legislation. It came out recently that the former ARRI director, Sean Kirkpatrick, was actually lobbying against the UAPDA. I think he was saying that the review board would basically would make ARRI basically redundant in terms of what they're doing. And then I think there's another aspect to it as well. I think that there are some members of Congress who do feel afraid about this legislation because the intelligence community, I think, has gone rogue. And I think there are some really, really bad elements to this intelligence community. And I think there are some people who are part of these committees who are afraid that they're compromised by the intelligence community. Maybe they've got some skeletons in their past, and they're afraid that they are compromised, that some of these details might come out, or maybe they could be threatened. So I think there's an element of that at play as well.
That's really important. And it's one of those things that is never discussed openly in public, not simply in the United States, but I think anywhere, is the extent of probable blackmail and other kinds of control exerted over people. I've heard the phrase control file being used more than once as a way to refer to how the intelligence community will control politicians. And so this is something that you think you have run into. I don't want you to put anybody on the spot here, but are you suggesting that you've actually uncovered, let's say, reason to believe that this is actively the case relating to this legislation, that there are members of Congress afraid of being blackmailed or being exposed in some way?
All I will say is, information that's already out there in the public. I think it's been said. I think it was Tucker Carlson or someone like that who basically said that a lot of these members of a lot of these politicians are actually quite scared of the intelligence community. Look, there are some really, really nasty factions of the intelligence community. We were warned before releasing the Office of Global Access story that there are some people who are not very nice and they're capable of very, very bad things if this story came to light. And I was also warned as well about the undersea retrieval program, which is one of the most tightly guarded secrets, basically, in terms of classification. That if you went public with any of the details, there are some really, really nasty people. And the best you could do if you report on these details is go public and be as public as possible. That's your best form of protection. And there are other. I just don't think that Congress is fully aware of what's going on. I think a lot of these politicians, especially in the US, are going to fundraisers. They've got other things they're actually focused on, and that allows the deep state, basically, as some people would call it, to run free and do what they want. I've also been informed about, possibly retrievals of objects in space. If you search for it, there are ways that you could deorbit objects orbiting around the Earth. So what's to say that's not the case with UAP as well?
Deorbiting UAP, is that okay? So this is not something that I have really come across, and I want to ask about the undersea retrievals in a moment. But can you just expand on this idea of deorbiting UAP? It sounds like am I wrong here? Attempting to take down an, let's say, alien craft that's in Earth orbit. How could they possibly do that unless they're shooting it down? Maybe is that what deorbiting a space-based UAP would be?
So the conversation has come up with one of my sources before about potentially retrieving objects from space, UAP from space, and from there, I mean, I can't source this saying that my sources have told me, but I've looked it up, and you can deorbit satellites, old satellites that you want to land back into Earth. So I can imagine that if you did have such a mission, it's come across like this is just my imagination here, okay? Maybe with a little bit of information from sources as well. So it's been explained to me that some UAP are brought down through dogfights, like you see two UAPs and they're dogfighting each other basically. So that could be one of the scenarios. It ends up as being deactivated so that you're able to deorbit it, or it could be potentially that I don't know, an EMP blast or some type like that to disable it. I don't know. It could be something like that. Right. But I would say that any such mission like that, you'd have to have the National Reconnaissance Office involved, Space Force, Space Command, and then obviously you'd have the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is involved as well in terms of like, okay, where will this land? How do we track this now and recover it? So there'd be a lot of those elements involved, I can imagine. But obviously, this is just my imagination here. This is not from any sources at all, apart from the information about apparent dogfights. But otherwise, this is just me and my imagination going wild here of how it could work.
let me just say, I'm completing research on a fairly substantial USO project. And I have come across claims of dogfights among UAP in the 21st century that are one in particular that I'm thinking of was supported by at least 3 specific witnesses reporting separately to a particular website about it. I'll have all of that out at some point. The idea of UFOs or UAP dogfighting each other seems a little out there for people, but there have been a number of these at least allegations that are out there. So it's interesting that you're stumbling into this as well. Very interesting. Relating to the UAP legislation, I want to stick with that for a little longer, if you don't mind, and then move on to some other things that you've been researching. One thing I've noticed in terms of the opposition to this act, both last year and this year, seems to be dominated by members of the Republican Party. I can't think that they are the only opponents to this. I mean, the Democratic Party has its own deep connection to what we can call the deep state. But it nevertheless does seem to be the case. In your article, I was a bit surprised, but maybe I shouldn't be, that you had Rand Paul as one of the people giving resistance. And then you just said now that his staff has denied that. So that's, we don't really know. But have you gotten a sense of how, can you give a more concrete sense of the resistance to this? Have you been able to get a handle on, is it absolutely stemming from the contractors, or is it from the intelligence community, or these members of Congress just ideologically opposed? We were hinting that there might be some pressure exerted on these members of Congress. Can you just go into that a little bit more? Is there anything else you can say about this?
Sure. So firstly, just to address the Rand Paul point, and maybe give that a bit more context as well. In terms of that, I mean, I had spoken to one of my sources, and over the summer, that source told me that Senator Chris Coons, one of his members of staff, had told him that the resistance was coming from Rand Paul. So I had knowledge of it back then. And I think someone else also did say to me that actually it wasn't personal against the UAP stuff. He was just going out and opposing anything that was coming from Chuck Schumer, that was supported from Schumer, but more of a political thing. So who knows? And now I've been told that there's really, really good intelligence pointing to opposition from Senator Mitch McConnell as well. So yeah. It's difficult to piece it together. I'm not sure. Whatever, definitively find out. But in terms of, I mean, So it seemed from last time in terms of resistance, it was coming from different places. So you had resistance from the Arrow, so that's the Defense Department from Sean Kirkpatrick. There was likely resistance as well from the intelligence community, and then you had the defense contractors as well, allegedly, who were against it. Look, I think so. The way it works in terms of the Office of Global Access and a lot of these retrieval missions is they have their preferred contractors, so they have their Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons, BAE Systems, perhaps as well. And then you've got your newer contractors who are new to the game. Some people suggested Radiance Technology. I think Danny put that out there, Danny Sheehan. So then you've got your new players to the game as well, and they're kind of like, actually, I want a bit of the action as well. Why does Lockheed get to have all the fun? Let's create our own connections to the CIA so that we can get access to some of these craft, or maybe let's see if we can do a transfer from Lockheed Martin to us, something like that. So then all of a sudden, when you get this eminent domain provision, it's kind of like, oh gosh, if that goes through, that means like, this craft that we could potentially get our hands on, it could be ruined and all upset by this process. And also the added transparency on top of this as well. So, we could suddenly lose possession of this thing. So, I mean, that could come to play. Obviously, that's just speculation just coming from me. But I think that might play a part of it. And I mean, it's come out recently in an interview between Lue Elizondo and George Knapp about the and it's been reported as well by George Knapp, Com Kelleher, and Lukatsky,
James Lukatsky. Yeah,
yes, that's it. That they were they were basically trying to get transfer of materials, let's say UAP materials, from Lockheed Martin, supported by, from my understanding, it was actually 2 vice presidents perhaps that were actually supportive and backing this kind of transfer going on to Bigelow's facility. And that was stopped by a very, very important person within the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. A very, very powerful person.
I think we're getting closer to the real issue here. And I'm wondering if a lot of this, maybe not all of it, but if a lot of this is about who's going to get access to this exotic technology. Is that really what is happening? And you mentioned Robert Bigelow just now. I'm not the only one who's wondered about this, I'm sure, many times. Is this the play that's going on? Certain number of individuals who are prominent, who have their own connections, learned absolutely that, yes, there is such a program to acquire non-human alien technology and bodies, biologics, and they want a piece of it. They want a piece of the action. And I have been wondering, I mean, who can expect that everyone's motives are as pure as the driven snow? We like to think that actors out there are just doing this because they believe in it. They want the truth to come out to the public. And maybe they do. Maybe they want some of that truth out there. But isn't it at least as likely that they've got their own interest in this? And I've often wondered, access to the technology would certainly be a big motivator, and that would be Bigelow. And then you can imagine people at Lockheed thinking, who the hell is Bigelow thinking he can get into our game? And so goes the battle. Is that what you think you're seeing here, Chris?
I think Lockheed Martin is kind of like the US government. There are many faces to it. Although there could be some, important people within the organization, like those 2 vice presidents I was alluding to, who would be for the transfer. I think there would be others that would be against it.
Are you able to mention who these vice presidents are who have been involved in this? Is this not something that you can do? I don't want to put you on the spot here. If you can't, then don't. But
yeah, so I mean, one of the names has been put out there by Lue Elizondo in that interview. So that's James Ryder. So he was the vice president for space systems within Lockheed Martin. Actually, if you go and search it up on the rep web, you can see him. He's spoken at a conference before about UFOs. During the last years of his life, he was going to these spiritual conferences, talking about consciousness and spirituality and the electric universe. And it just made you think, for someone from such a technical background who rose all the way to the top at Lockheed Martin, where they've got the most advanced technology and systems available to them, what led this person to suddenly become really, really interested in consciousness and spirituality? Like, what occurred? What has this person seen that's kind of like driven them down that path?
Mm-hmm.
That's the really, really curious thing for me to think about. So I just think that's really, really interesting. That, I would say that. So I think some of the older materials may not actually. I think they may have been leased, let's say, to Lockheed Martin from the CIA, and maybe that was brought to bear. This isn't yours in the first place. Maybe that was brought to bear, but I think the threats that Jim Ryder got from that, I think they really scared him away, and they freaked him out. So he, and I think it was cumulative, because they tried to do the same thing with the Department of Homeland Security as well. The Homeland Security was trying to get this material as well, and that was stopped by the same person within the CIA. He is not a good influence. This person is not. And
is
look,
is this a name that you know and you just can't say at the moment, or is this a name that you don't yet know?
It's a name that I don't want to say, and I believe some people do know the name, but I don't think they want to say it themselves, and I don't feel comfortable saying it. I think I probably crossed the line already with my USO stuff. But yeah, there are some really, really bad people out there, I would say. And look, when we did the Office of Global Access story as well, I'd note that there was actually a warning that came on to Google when that story got released, saying that this is still a very new story. Don't trust everything that you see or something along those lines, because this is new information coming out. It was very, very rare that you got those warnings from Google. Well, I had never seen one before. But yeah, I think with Google as well, you've got to look at the trust and safety team. A lot of the trust and safety team have formerly worked at the CIA. And obviously you've got a relationship between big tech and In-Q-Tel as well, which is the commercial arm of the CIA. So, stuff like that does remind you that there are various ways that they could hurt you if they want, and threaten you. So they're immensely powerful, these people are.
I think you're doing, and let's mention Josh Boswell here again. And I think Matt Ford was one of the authors of your piece on the Office of Global Access. I think you're all doing very important work, and let's just put it out there, brave work in exposing some of this information.
Look at this issue here. This has been going on for decades. This has been going on since the late 1940s. Now, when I say that, people go, wait a minute. You talking about Roswell? Was Roswell real?
Was Roswell real?
It was, absolutely.
Okay, so what was at Roswell?
There was a crash. It was a vehicle that had broken into two pieces, and it was recovered by the United States government, taken to a secure military installation, and then from there it went out to certain locations. What is in that book, I'm allowed to talk about. That went through the Pentagon review process, so I am legally able to talk about it. There are things that I'm still not yet allowed to talk about.
What are those things? Tell us those things. That sounds like.
Well, let's see here. I do not look good in an orange jumpsuit, so I got to be very careful. Are
you gonna look good in whatever jumpsuit the aliens put on you? You better.
Because in Lue Elizondo's latest interview on Glenn Beck, he tells the full story of what happened at Roswell, what happened with the craft, and what happened with these bodies. And he held the material from the craft in his hand. That's according to Lue Elizondo, okay? He's personally saying he held pieces of the Roswell crash in his hand, and that it's been studied by multiple laboratories, including JPL from NASA, right? And they're saying they have no idea how this was made back then, right, in the late 40s. Impossible to have been made. Well, not impossible to have been made, but impossible to have been made by humans. So here's the first clip, Lue Elizondo on Glenn Beck.
What happened that day and what is left? Where how much of this material were there bodies?
Yeah.
Tell me what happened that day.
So as the report goes, there was actually two incidents. There was two crashes, not one. And one was partially recovered, and there were biological specimens inside, allegedly 4, and they were very quickly whisked away, taken to the military base to lock them down. They didn't want the locals touching them or getting a hold of them. And of course, we know what happened after that, which was this campaign to say, oh, no, these are Mylar balloons and stuff like that. No, these were crash test dummies that came down. Well, that's interesting because we weren't using dummies back then for some of these tests. We weren't using dummies until later. So these specimens were looked at. I don't know where they went after that, and where the material went after that. The trail gets kind of cold. Turns out later that there was another U.S. military installation, Wright-Patterson in Ohio, that also was involved in looking at material of crashed unknown vehicles of unknown origin. And it's there's even some very interesting documentation out there if you know where to find it. Again, that's completely unclassified. Anybody can look at it. There's a site called the Black Vault. The gentleman who runs that has a huge library of Freedom of Information Act releases that the U.S. government, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the Department of Defense, the DIA have all released over the years. And there's a treasure trove of these documents. And when you start reading these documents and realizing these are official government documents to the director of the FBI, from the director of the FBI to the director of the CIA, the National Security Council, these are real. These are legit. This is not Lue Elizondo telling you this. This is your government telling you this. And I think this is part of my
government always lies to us. So
sure. Yeah, no, touche, of course. But, a lieutenant colonel that's there in the field writing a report, they're not lying to you. A politician, maybe. A senior person that's trying to cover their butt, yeah. But, a low-level lieutenant colonel who's there, who's an MP, military police, is just writing the report to his general, they're not lying to you. That's a real report written by a real individual about a real occurrence.
All right, so there's 2 crashes, not just one. And to be honest, I've covered this part of the story before on the podcast, and it was Hal Puthoff who told Luis Elizondo that. And it was one of the very first things Hal Puthoff ever told Luis Elizondo, because that's what Luis Elizondo claimed in his new book, Imminent, right? And I think it's probably one of the first stories that convinced Luis Elizondo there's more to this UFO thing, right? But, where does it go from there, right? What are we going to do about Roswell, right? And this information, I guess. Like, what do we do with it? Regardless, in this next clip of the interview, he talks about the material, right? And personally holding it in his hands. Now, the assumption is made that the material is from Roswell, right? And you'll see in the clip why. But also, that's literally what Glenn Beck tweeted out. Former Pentagon UFO hunter Lue Elizondo tells me he personally held the material recovered from the 1947 Roswell incident. There were 2 crashes, not one. The material requires a degree of tech to manufacture that did not exist at the time it was found, at least with humans. So if anyone in the comments is going to be like, he's not talking about the material from Roswell, I'm just going off the information that was reported, right? You can make the decision for yourself. He's definitely talking about a material from the past because of how he talks about it. So, look, let's just listen to it, and then we can discuss and erase all this confusion. Here we go.
So have you been allowed to see anything? I mean, I assume there's been other crashes. Have you been able to actually see this evidence with your own eyes, the actual physical evidence?
Yeah, I actually gave a briefing to a senior member of the Department of Defense in 2017, several briefings, about the material that I personally have held in my hand. I have held it in my hand, and so have other individuals that, and I'm not going to say who they were, that worked for very, very high-end aerospace companies, best of the best, and they're looking at this from an engineering perspective, and they're scratching their head. They're saying, I can see it, I believe it, but I can't believe this material was found back then. And under those circumstances, this material, we did not have the engineering capability. It isn't an engineered piece of material. It's layered. It was studied by NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It's been studied by other organizations as well. And of course, that's really the gold standard, isn't it? When you have material that you can analyze and you can look at that material and succinctly say, yeah, this material is very special and it requires an X degree amount of technology to manufacture or reproduce. And frankly, it did not exist at the time the material was found, at least not with us, with humans.
So they have a perception. And one of the things that you said earlier is that they think that the greater population is not good and that they will turn on you and that they're evil and that they'll...
That's one faction. So what I found was that there were several different factions within the perception management of UFOs. And one of the factions was responsible for sadly harassing people who do research. And I found this out by being harassed.
How so? How were you harassed?
Okay, so, here I am, just your average professor doing their work and doing it pretty well. At my university, I was the chair of my department, well regarded by my colleagues and students, and never really doing anything weird, right? And then I start to study UFOs, thinking that they're not real, thinking that it's just a new form of religion, and then quickly having people come into my research sphere, who are part of CIA, part of FBI, that kind of thing. And then getting a shock that, whoa, this could be dangerous and maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And thinking, but...
just simply because those people are contacting you?
It indicated to me that there was something that I shouldn't maybe be doing, that it could be dangerous.
Right. That you could suffer consequences for your curiosity or for your research.
Yeah.
And that they would punish you. Or you could be punished, or
That's
you could
what
be
I thought.
targeted.
Yeah.
No, most certainly.
And plus, I had done some research on UFOs by that time, of course.
But what is it about the research, and what is about what you could possibly uncover that would be so dangerous?
Okay, so of course, that's a question that's loaded. So
Yes.
I'm going to talk a little bit about. I'll answer it in part.
Okay.
So in part, this is before the crash retrieval became a term that Congress used.
Right.
So I was...
what year are we talking about?
So I started in 2012.
Okay.
By 2015 and 16, I was already in full shock mode of, wow, this is bigger than I thought. And I had been invited to go to a crash retrieval spot in New Mexico that was under a no-fly zone. And I still didn't believe, though, in UFOs at this point. You have to understand that. So I just thought that the person inviting me is Tyler. He's a scientist. He works for the Space Force. He believes this, and I'm wondering, how does he even believe that this is real? We're going with Gary Nolan, who's from Stanford, and he's out. But at the time, I called him James in my book. And I'm the one actually who invited him to go because I didn't really want to go by myself, And so I insisted that Gary go with me. And Tyler figured out who Gary was, and he said, okay. So we went out there. We had to actually wear blindfolds. And it was out in the middle of this place in New Mexico. I don't know where. I know what was near it, but I don't know where the actual place was. And we were looking for parts, right, that had been put out there. And during the time period, so I think part of it was the danger was that parts exist, right? So things like this do exist, and there are anomalous materials. This is what I was finding out, and I think that this is what I'm an okay researcher. It's not like I would make this up, nor would I lie. I'm publishing with Oxford, so my reputation is at stake, right? So I'm doing the best I can to kind of adjudicate, like, am I being fed disinformation or, what's going on. Gary now will be able to identify by taking these parts back and analyzing them through his laboratories, whether or not they're engineered or not. And he's been doing that ever since. So these are the kinds of things that I would have found out. I think part of it was also that I was finding out that there was an oral tradition and that the perception management was very tight. And I think this is what they were afraid. But I've said this now publicly, so.
So tell me about the crash retrieval site.
Yeah. So this is so now you have to understand this is a long time period. So I start this in 2012. I get this shock where I'm being, people are asking me to meet, people from these programs and from the Space Force. And I'm actually not meeting with them because I'm waiting. I'm kind of thinking I've got to think this through. It wasn't until about 2014 that I actually start to meet the people, like the affiliated people. And they show me some things and they asked me to go to this crash retrieval site in New Mexico.
No, this is a recent crash?
No, it's okay. So this crash is part of a series of crashes that happened in the 1940s.
So the Roswell.
It wasn't Roswell, actually. It was one of the crash sites that's near. It's in New Mexico, but it's not Roswell.
So there was more than one crash in New Mexico.
Yeah, I think they
allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah. They said that there were probably 4, maybe even more. I don't know.
What a bunch of UFOs keep crashing.
I know. That's what. Well, they don't believe that they crashed. They use that term, but they don't think it's a crash. They think that it's. They personally, I'll tell you from a professor's standpoint, like their idea of this is that it's a donation. They call it the donation site. So they think that these were donated materials and they're going to get information, and they do. And that's how Tyler was able to create a lot of the things that he created through, and he would fly these on the space shuttle, by the way, these experiments and so forth. It was very, very fascinating to me. I mean, I think anybody would be fascinated with it, to tell you the truth.
When you say fly these, you don't mean physical materials.
So he would have an idea that he would get through these protocols that I told you about. So he practices these protocols, and it would be related to something that he would then want to fly on the space shuttle, because this was during the time the space shuttle was happening. And the space shuttle had anti-gravity environments, and he needed these environments in order to create this. And now this is actually a whole field called biologics. So there's a real field now where people are doing these experiments in space and creating things that we can't create here.
Like what?
Medicine, certain types of metals, kind of like ceramic metals. He created something. I actually wrote about this and published about it. Totally academic paper, so most general readers would never read it. It's because it has academic jargon in it. But I talked all about it.
Got something here. Researchers capitalize on microgravity in space to accelerate drug discovery and development. That was one of the speculations about the type of metals that were retrieved, supposedly, from these crash sites, that these, whatever these metals were, they were layered, and that they could only be layered specifically the way they were done in a zero-gravity environment.
Yeah, that's right. They were engineered. So
Right.
I actually did talk to Gary before I came on your podcast, because I just wanted to be sure, because I don't want to represent his research incorrectly.
Right.
So I said, can you please, recap it? He always thinks I'm an idiot too. He's like, how many times have I told you this? So, yeah, so he has parts from various of the crash sites that are clearly engineered. Not by humans.
Right.
But he's not going to jump to the conclusion that it's extraterrestrial. He says, we just don't know.
Right. It's just something that is outside of the realm of our current understanding of how we create physical materials.
That's correct.
And how much of this stuff do they have? Do they have full crafts?
I've never seen any full crafts.
What did you see when you went to the crash site?
So I saw 2 types of materials. One, I can say, looks like kind of metallic frog skin.
Now that gets into a rather puzzling question that's vexed me for a long time. So there are reports that these things crash. but they can't have been doing that for very long, because whenever a human throughout history finds a piece of metal, say a meteorite, they use it. Even if you don't even know how to smelt metal, you still use the meteorite metal, because you haven't seen anything like that before. And there are, archaeological examples of nickel iron meteorites hammered into points. And this was even done into historic times. Maasai warriors in Namibia had access to the Gibeon meteorite and were hammering it into spear points into recent memory, until they realized that the meteorites were worth something on eBay. Same thing with in Greenland. There was the Cape York meteorite that was used by local peoples for harpoons.
I mean, John, let's not forget, King Tut's tomb and the famous dagger, the nickel
the meteorite dagger. But what we don't have is an aluminum one, or a piece of titanium done like that in an archaeological context.
Well, we believe that the crashes are more recent and may be due to a vulnerability. And particularly in the way the propulsion systems work. And that is to say that certain electromagnetic pulses, think of an EMP, just like they can disable my cell phone or this computer, can also interfere with the propulsion units of these vehicles because of the way they operate.
So radar or some sort of EMP or something like that, they're susceptible.
Correct, or the detonation of an atomic weapon or the testing of an atomic weapon. There is a very strong EMP that is released, electromagnetic pulse, that interferes with all sorts of conventional technology, and it's quite possible. And there's also a huge burst of neutrinos as well, and neutrons. As well. So, I'm not going to bore you and your audience with a science lesson on atomic and nuclear technology, but it does seem to be a correlation there that the U.S. government has recognized.
Lou, that means that we've recently become some kind of a threat to this phenomenon, right? In other words, we are dangerous now.
Well, certainly we are not as susceptible willing subjects. It means that we have an ability to potentially interfere with whatever they are, and they seem to recognize that. We can ascribe all sorts of intent behind it, but it does appear that, at least superficially, that they have a vulnerability.
Now, certainly someone within the government noticed that, because I do not buy it when a government official comes out in a hearing or whatever and says that whatever it is, it does not appear to be a national security threat. Of course it's a national security threat when you don't know what it is. And given that we sometimes can't even see gigantic Chinese spy balloons, we may have a problem here. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Look, we're getting into a part of a conversation here that I find interesting. Some people may find disturbing. But look, governments are no different than religions or any other type of institution where the citizens have placed their faith and confidence into a particular organization. Again, whether it's a government or religion or anything like that. And governments in particular have one job, and that is to protect their citizens from threats, whether it's environmental threats or military threats or ecological threats or financial threats. It is not a good spot to be in as a government to identify a problem for which you don't have a solution for. Okay? And if people say, oh, well, that's nonsensical. Look, we do it all the time. Let me give you a case in point. When we first developed the U-2 spy plane, when the CIA had the plane commissioned with Lockheed Skunk Works, we did it in direct contravention to the peace treaty we had with Russia at the time, which was we would not fly manned reconnaissance missions over mainland Russia. But we did because we were afraid they were building nukes and we wanted to keep an eye on them. So what was our choice? Well, we would build a plane that would fly higher and faster than anything else, and the Russians would never be able to detect us. And you know what? It seemed like that was the case because for the first few missions we flew over Russia, the Russians didn't react. And so we thought, holy crap, we did it. That was to say until the Russians developed the SA-2 surface-to-air missile and successfully shot a U-2 down, and then went on to parade Captain Powers and the aircraft, bits and pieces of it, in front of the United Nations and the world, right? They did not even admit to their own Russian people that we had this capability until when? Until they had a solution to negate that threat, right? It wasn't until they could shoot down the U-2 did they ever admit that they even knew about it. And this is very common for all governments, because governments are supposed to be solution focused. And when you don't have a solution to a problem, it creates great anxiety, and it also creates distrust, animosity, fear, and that's not what we want our citizens to feel. So therein lies part of the problem, that we don't like to admit problems that there are no solutions for until there's a solution.
You know, you can always look back, and UFOs were always very actively showing up where our nuclear weapons were, anything to do with nuclear weapons, nuclear tests, and things of that nature. So I had, someone important posit a hypothetical to me that I took to be a very pointed conversation, on a very purposeful conversation, because of who the person was. And back in 1963, there was a nuclear test in space called Starfish Prime. Now, anyone can go out there and read about Starfish Prime, and you can go on Wikipedia and see all about it. And the idea of it was to really see what electromagnetic pulse would do in the vacuum of space, the EMP wave. Now, the EMP wave is what we hear about. If a nuke goes off, it'll shut off all of our electricity and burn all of our electrical systems and whatever. So one of the fears we've always had as a country is, would the Soviets detonate a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere above America, and just that EMP wave would come down and just wipe us back to the Stone Age, all of our computers, all of our phone lines, everything. So we definitely have had those fears, and so have other countries. So when Starfish Prime was one of the attempts to launch something into space and test how that EMP wave would travel. What's interesting about it is when you look it up and read about it, it actually did take out a satellite or two, is what it discusses. Well, I have very high reason to believe that maybe it did take out a satellite, but it really brought down something else as well. And then the question becomes, did we know that it might bring something else down? And or maybe a few of us knew, and the rest of the people on the team did not know. They just thought they were testing something in space. So I had some pretty deep, meaningful conversations about Starfish Prime with the right people. And so what I wanted to do was, because there's something important about what it brought down. I mean, what it brought down led to a shift in thinking about what's here and what we thought of the UFO phenomenon. So for me, I wanted to create a story that can house some of that information and kind of look at it in a new way.
Now, I think at this stage, to be honest, Geoff, our audience's heads are spinning with the complexity of what we're talking about. So I want you to take me to the other bit of evidence that you've got that I just find fascinating. And this is the nuclear tests in the Pacific, where the Americans were testing a type of technology which essentially was designed to incapacitate ICBMs and possibly also satellites by using X-rays. Just explain to me what was going on, what this testing was all about, and talk me through what happened.
Well, McCone replaced Dulles, and obviously the management change was the same management as the old management. So Khrushchev said, "You're not playing the game. We know that you're fooling with our radar." And Jean Petit even mentions about the Cuban Missile Crisis in that classified report that he wrote. So they were fooling around with the radar system still during the atmospheric test program known as Operation Dominic. There was a a sub-program called Operation Fishbowl, which was nuclear weapons detonations in space or near space, where the effects of the nuclear weapons propagate differently from the atmosphere. And they discovered that high energy X-rays could actually take out incoming ICBM re-entry vehicles by a process called thermomechanical spallation, just from the high energy X-rays. But the design of the weapon was completely different to all the other EMP weapons that they developed. So it was an X-ray weapon, not a gamma ray weapon.
Now, the thing I find fascinating about this is it required the use of a large quantity of solid gold in the warhead of the weapon. Just explain that to me.
That's because gold in its outer valence shell only has one electron. So it's a process used in modern day X-ray machines called Bremsstrahlung radiation, where the electron is blasted out of the atom, and when it comes in vicinity of another nucleus of another atom, it actually orbits around the atom, but in doing so releases X-ray energy, because you can't destroy or create energy. But yeah, that's what they were testing, and they'd failed 3 times. So they'd blown up an enormous amount of gold from the US Treasury, because that particular was called the Bluegill test, which was a specific X-ray test. It had failed 3 times. Kennedy was not happy because the gold was from the US Treasury and it was vaporized. But
tell me what happened in the key event that we have videos of. So there are videos of what we're about to talk about. And when you're referring to those videos, can you actually specifically talk to the video so that our editors know what to include in this video?
Yep. So tensions are building up in Cuba. So there's a Atlas 8F missile test in the Cape Canaveral on the 19th of September 1962. It's a dummy test. There's no live warhead on it. They just want to see how accurate the re-entry vehicle is to the target. Once the re-entry vehicle has separated from the main Atlas missile, it starts its re-entry run. There's pyrotechnics and other things. They call them penetration aids to fool radar. So if you try to shoot the warhead, you've got multiple targets to choose from. Once the penetration aids burn up, the RV is filmed by a high-flying KC-135 specialised aircraft run by EG&G of all people.
So the RV is a re-entry vehicle.
Yep, it's re-entering the atmosphere. It's travelling at Mach 18, which is 20,000 feet per second. And an object materializes right alongside it and paces this RV for a minute and a half. So
how do we know this? What's that source to? Is that an authentic document that sources that claim?
That was it's footage that Arrow has actually deemed a UFO incident, and they've put it in the National Archives. Anyone can see it. And I found
this is the bit I love. Sorry, Geoff, I've just got to savor this for a moment. So this is a real UFO sighting of some kind of anomalous object that appeared next to the testing of a re-entry vehicle off an ICBM, an American ICBM. And this is traveling at 18 times the speed of sound. And what does this object do around this re-entry vehicle warhead?
It's quite strange, because it seems to phase itself into existence and pulse, and then just travels alongside the re-entry vehicle for a minute and a half, and then slowly starts to phase itself out of existence.
So it's clearly intelligently controlled.
Well, yeah. The Americans are scratching their heads now, thinking, is this a Soviet payback for the palladium? Are they doing something to us now? So NASA and the US Air Force are unsure. I found the post-flight test report of that missile test, and they said that the object's origin or identification could not be determined. So they don't know.
But The crucial point is, and I just want to re-emphasize this, ARROW, the Pentagon's UFO investigation office, the official UFO investigation office for the Pentagon, the last thing ARROW ever wants to do is acknowledge that a UFO is real and potentially anomalous, potentially perhaps NHI. But in this case, they've acknowledged that this is a real UAP. They haven't been able to explain it prosaically, and they acknowledge officially in one of their reports that this Atlas RV UAP object is real.
That's right. They put that in the category in the National Archives, UFO category. So we couldn't do that today, Ross, with our technology, let alone in 1962, basically.
No, well, I mean, there's nothing. We have nothing that can fly at 18 times the speed of sound. And this is in the atmosphere too, isn't it? It's not in orbit.
It's just re-entering the atmosphere, yes.
Yeah.
So that's September. That's in September 1962, in the lead up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 24th of October, Strategic Air Command have found the missiles getting moved to Cuba by Khrushchev, the intermediate range ballistic missiles, nuclear tipped. So Strategic Air Command goes to DEFCON 2. That's the only time in history that they've ever done that. So they're ready to go in for a preemptive nuclear strike to the Soviet Union. 17 selected targets, LeMay has called the Grand Tour. They're ready to go. So,
and just to make the point here, if anything validates President Kennedy's concern that whether they're spoofed or whether they're real, like they apparently were in the Atlas test, whatever they are, these UAPs are causing a ramping of the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's a vindication for JFK's concerns that if the Soviets and the Americans weren't open with each other about UAPs, this could lead to a tragic confrontation where one side fears that the other side is launching some kind of preemptive attack. That's the significance of that UFO that was seen at the Atlas test, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
But then, Geoff, take me forward to what then happens, because there is another test and another set of videos. What do you find? What have you uncovered?
So on the 25th of October, about 15 minutes to midnight, they launched Bluegill Triple Prime, which is a Thor intermediate range ballistic missile, single stage, launches this special, it's called the X1, which is the gold spherical secondary X-ray nuclear weapon. They launch it around, they want to detonate it around midnight to get the maximum effect, because at that point of time in the day, the ionosphere is at its highest point, because it's like a teardrop shape from the Earth in relation to the sun. So this weapon detonates at just a few minutes past midnight on the 26th of October, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's another two KC-135 aircraft. Its whole tests are fully instrumented, because they've never actually fired one of these weapons before, because it's failed the previous 3 times. So there's two KC-135s operated by EG&G, because they developed a special high-speed Rapatronic camera that take the footage, because in the, I believe it's possibly still the same today, the only way to determine a nuclear weapon yield is to watch its expansion rate in the first few microseconds of the detonation. So these two aircraft have got these high-speed cameras watching the detonation. One has the call sign Kettle 1. The other one has the call sign Kettle 2. So during the blast, Kettle 1, you can see an object, and the fireball is approximately only a few milliseconds after the detonation. The fireball is approximately a kilometre wide. A bright, fiery object tumbles out from within the nuclear fireball, and it's plain as day. You can slow it down and see this very bright object. It must be at least 50 to 100 metres long, tumble out from within the nuclear fireball.
You believe that that is some kind of craft?
Just like the one that was following the Atlas 8F test, but this time it was a real warhead.
So this is speculation, of course, because we just simply don't know what was recovered. But you believe potentially there were non-human intelligences of some kind watching these American tests, keeping a very close observation on what was going on, and that because they were using this technology that was designed to knock out missiles with essentially an X-ray pulse, it also knocked out the UFO.
That's correct. The scientists put that detonation in a point in space and time that there was no other debris or aircraft or anything in the local area, because they wanted to see the weapons effects of this X-ray device. Now, what's interesting
Couldn't
is
it be debris from the missile?
No, because the missile is hundreds of kilometers away by that point in time. It's launched 170 kilometer apogee. It's released the re-entry vehicle. It's